Ever get stuck in a meeting with someone, someone who's just impossible to deal with? You know what I'm talking about, right? That person who just hijacks every conversation or just seems to radiate
Yeah.
negativity. Ugh, it's the worst. Well, thankfully, in today's deep dive, we're going to tackle this universal problem: difficult people.
Yeah, and you've come to the right place. We're going to be diving into Roy Lilley's management training program, and it's packed with insights and practical strategies that you can use right away, whether you're dealing with a difficult boss or coworker or even a customer.
That's great because a lot of you have shared some experiences that are making work a real struggle. So let's get tactical. What's the first step in dealing with these challenging personalities?
Well, I would say the first step is understanding them. Lilly actually provides this framework called the seven deadly sins of difficult personalities. And it's a really clever way to kind of categorize those challenging individuals we all encounter.
Okay, I'm intrigued, the seven deadly sins, but I'm assuming this isn't a literal interpretation of the sins, right?
Exactly. It's not about making a moral judgment. He's using the concept of sins to highlight the root of the difficult behavior. So, we have the hostile type, the negative one, the silent treatment expert, the super agreeable, the know-it-all, the indecisive, and the complainer.
So basically, the whole spectrum of frustrating behaviors you could encounter in an office, huh?
Precisely. And while the labels are themselves helpful, the real value comes from understanding the motivations behind each sin. Like, for example, the hostile person might be driven by insecurity or fear, while the know-it-all might just be craving validation and recognition.
That's interesting. So it's not just about labeling people, but about trying to figure out what's driving their behavior. Does that actually make them easier to deal with?
Absolutely. When you understand that underlying motivation, you can tailor your approach accordingly.
So can you give me an example? Let's say I'm dealing with the classic Mr. Angry. What's the best way to handle that situation?
Well, first off, you need to recognize that engaging with someone in a heated state is almost always counterproductive.
So don't try to reason with a raging bull.
Exactly. Let them cool off. Let them vent without interrupting or getting defensive. Once things have calmed down, then you can try to address the issue rationally.
Yeah, I've definitely learned that the hard way a few times. But what about those people who are constantly trying to one-up everyone? The ones that Lily calls competition crazy.
Ah, yes, the ones who always need to be on top. It can be incredibly draining, but a useful tactic is to acknowledge their need for validation. Just give them a quick ego boost, like a genuine compliment about their work or a specific achievement.
Okay, so stroke their ego a bit, but then what?
And then you immediately redirect the conversation back to the matter at hand. You could say something like, that's a great point you make. Now, getting back to the issue we were discussing.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging their need for recognition without letting them derail the entire conversation. It's a subtle art, for sure.
It is, but with practice, you can master it. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have those who barely contribute at all, the masters of the silent treatment.
Oh, the silent unresponsives. Those can be so challenging. You ask them a question and you're met with a blank stare. It's like pulling teeth.
The key here is patience. Don't try to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Instead, ask open-ended questions that encourage them to elaborate. Sometimes that silence is a strategy, a way to avoid revealing information or even masking their own anxieties.
So it's like they're playing a high-stakes poker game, trying not to give anything away.
That's a great analogy. And just like in poker, patience and observation are your best allies.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the angry ones, the competitive ones, and the silent ones. What about the know-it-alls? How do you suggest navigating their constant need to be right?
Know-it-alls can be tricky. One strategy is to leverage their thirst for knowledge. Assign them a task that plays to their expertise or ask them to, research a specific topic. It kind of feeds their ego while also benefiting the team.
Okay, that's clever. You're basically making them feel valued while also keeping their know-it-all tendencies in check.
Exactly. And if you ever need to challenge their viewpoint, stick to the facts. Presenting objective data can gently deflate their ego without creating a full-blown confrontation.
Right, because the last thing you want is a know-it-all meltdown.
Precisely. Diplomacy is key in those situations.
Speaking of delicate situations, let's talk about the egomaniacs. How do you recommend dealing with those who just crave constant attention and praise?
Well, with those individuals, you need to appeal to their vanity. Try giving them credit for your ideas. It might feel counterintuitive, but it can actually be quite effective.
You mean, hey, great idea. I got it from you, even if you didn't.
Not necessarily. You're not taking full credit away from yourself, but you're acknowledging their influence in a way that appeals to their ego.
That's a subtle but an interesting approach. What if they are actually on your team? Any strategies for that scenario?
If they're on your team, a good tactic is to ask for their help in recognizing others. So by giving them the responsibility of distributing praise, you're essentially using their ego to benefit the entire team.
Oh, I see what you're doing there. Very clever.
It's a win-win. Now, we still have two more sins to cover: the lazy bones and the backstabber.
Oh, those are some tough ones. Let's start with the lazy bones. How do you motivate someone who just seems, well, lazy?
With the lazy bones, it's all about breaking down projects into smaller, more manageable tasks with clear deadlines.
Hmm.
You want to avoid overwhelming them with large, complex projects. Instead, create a series of smaller wins that will kind of keep them moving forward.
It's like building momentum, one small step at a time.
Exactly. It's about creating a sense of accomplishment and forward progress,
Hmm.
which can be incredibly motivating for someone who might feel overwhelmed by, larger tasks.
That makes sense. Now, what about the backstabber? Those are the people you really have to watch out for, right?
Unfortunately, yes. Backstabbers can be a real challenge because you never quite know where you stand with them. They might be all smiles to your face, then turn around and undermine you behind your back.
I've had my fair share of dealings with those types. It's exhausting. What's the best way to protect yourself from their sneaky tactics?
Documentation is your best friend in this scenario. Keep detailed notes of meetings, agreements, and any interactions you have with them.
That way, if they try to pull a fast one, you've got the evidence to back you up.
Exactly. A paper trail can be incredibly powerful when dealing with someone who's prone to, distortions and manipulations.
Hmm.
I actually had a colleague who tried to back out of an agreement we had made.
Oh no, what happened?
Well, fortunately, I had sent him a follow-up email
Mhm.
summarizing our conversation, and when he tried to deny our agreement, I just forwarded him the email chain.
Boom, caught red-handed. I bet he was pretty embarrassed.
He was, and it really reinforced the importance of documenting everything, especially when dealing with someone might not be entirely trustworthy.
That's a fantastic tip. I'm definitely going to make that a habit from now on. So we've covered Lilley's 7 deadly sins, and we've explored some specific strategies for dealing with each type. But are there any overarching principles we can apply to navigating difficult people in general?
Absolutely. One of the most important things to remember is that most difficult behavior isn't personal.
Wait, really? It feels pretty personal when someone's yelling at you or trying to sabotage your work.
I get why it feels that way, but it's important to remember that difficult people are often operating from a place of their own internal struggles. Their behavior might be a reflection of their own insecurities, fears, or
So
anxieties.
it's more about them than it is about me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Their behavior is not an objective reflection of your worth or your competence. It's a projection of their own internal world.
That's a helpful way to reframe it. So if it's not personal, how should I approach these situations?
Well, the key is to detach yourself emotionally and focus on the desired outcome. What do you want to achieve in this interaction? What steps can you take to, move towards that goal?
So it's about being strategic rather than reactive.
Exactly. And that leads to another important principle. Focus on the issue, not the person. Address the problem behavior without attacking their character.
So avoid getting into personal attacks or name calling, no matter how tempting it might be in the heat of the moment.
Precisely. Stay professional and, stick to the facts. And of course, clear communication is paramount.
Because misunderstandings can breed resentment and conflict.
Absolutely. Be clear about your expectations, deadlines, and desired outcomes. And don't be afraid to over-communicate.
So document everything, over-communicate, and don't take it personally. Those are some really solid takeaways. But is there ever a point where it's just okay to walk away from a situation, even if you've tried all of these strategies?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If a situation is truly toxic, and you've exhausted all other options, sometimes the best solution is to remove yourself from that environment.
Because life is too short to be miserable at work.
Exactly. Your mental and emotional well-being are paramount. Now, so far, we've primarily focused on dealing with difficult colleagues and burnout. But, I know a lot of people struggle with difficult customers, too. Any advice for navigating those tricky situations? Yes, actually. Lilley outlines a 6-step process for handling difficult customers. Listen, sympathize, don't justify, make notes, agree on a course of action, and follow through.
Okay, that sounds like a solid framework. Let's break it down. So the first step is to really listen to the customer's complaint, even if you think they are wrong or being unreasonable.
Right. Show them you're truly listening through active listening techniques.
Hmm.
Nodding your head, making eye contact, and using verbal cues, things like, I understand. And as they're talking, take notes so you can accurately recall their concerns later.
That makes sense. What's the next step?
Sympathize. Even if you don't agree with their complaint, acknowledge their feelings. Something as simple as, I'm so sorry you had this experience, that sounds frustrating, can go a long way.
So it's about validating their emotions without necessarily agreeing with their perspective. What about step 3? Don't justify. What does that mean exactly?
Resist the urge to defend your company's actions, especially if the customer's already upset. Justifying your position, even if you're right, can make the customer feel like you're not taking their complaints seriously.
They feel dismissed and unheard. Okay, so we've listened, we've sympathized, and we've avoided justifying. What's next? Make notes, but I think we covered that earlier with the active listening piece, right?
Yes, taking notes is crucial throughout the interaction. It just demonstrates that you're paying attention and taking their concerns seriously.
Okay, and on to step 5. Agree on a course of action.
This step is all about finding a solution that addresses the customer's concerns. Be clear about what you can and cannot do and get their buy-in on the proposed solution.
And finally, follow through. This seems like the most important step of all.
You're absolutely right. Following through on your promises is crucial for rebuilding trust and turning a negative customer experience into a positive one.
It's about showing that you are reliable and that you care about resolving the issue. What about dealing with specific types of difficult customers? For example, what do you do if you have a screaming customer?
Yes, the dreaded screamer. It can be incredibly intimidating, but it's essential to remain calm and composed. Remember that their anger is often directed at the situation and not at you personally.
Yeah, easier said than done when someone's yelling in your face. Any practical tips for handling those heated moments?
Well, Lilley recommends using specific phrases to de-escalate the situation. Things like, I'm really sorry to hear this, or this sounds awful,
Hmm.
can acknowledge their feelings without admitting fault.
That makes sense. It's about diffusing the tension without escalating the conflict. It actually reminds me of that politician who totally mishandled a confrontation with a voter.
Oh, yes. What happened?
So a voter was yelling at him about some policy issue, and instead of trying to de-escalate the situation, he got all defensive and started arguing back. It was all caught on camera, of course, and it went viral.
That's a classic example of what not to do in a heated situation. It really highlights the importance of emotional intelligence and the ability to stay calm under pressure.
Absolutely. Speaking of turning lemons into lemonade, Lilley makes an interesting point about turning customer complaints into opportunities. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
He believes that complaints, even the most frustrating ones, can be valuable feedback. They can highlight areas where your company can improve its processes, products, or customer service.
So instead of viewing complaints as something negative, we should actually see them as opportunities for growth and improvement.
Exactly. By analyzing patterns in customer complaints, you can identify areas where your company is falling short and then make changes to improve the overall customer experience.
That's a great perspective. So we've covered dealing with difficult customers. Now let's talk about meetings. Meetings, let's be honest, can be breeding grounds for difficult behavior. Any tips for mastering those potentially challenging gatherings?
Absolutely. Meetings can be really tricky, especially when you have a room full of different personalities, all with their own agendas and communication styles. But there are strategies you can use to keep things productive and on track.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's hear those strategies.
One of Lilley's most practical tips is the 80-20 rule for meetings. It's about focusing on the 80% of an issue where you can quickly find agreement and moving forward.
So don't get bogged down in those tiny little details that can just derail the whole meeting.
Exactly. Aim for consensus on the main points and let the smaller details kind of work themselves out later. I've actually seen meetings go completely off the rails because people couldn't agree on some minor point that ultimately had very little impact on the overall project.
It's like missing the forest for the trees. You get so focused on one little thing that you lose sight of the bigger picture.
Precisely. And that's where a skilled meeting facilitator can really shine. Guiding the conversation and keeping everyone focused on those key objectives. Speaking of different personalities in meetings, Lilley identifies a whole cast of characters that can really make or break a productive gathering.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Let's dive into those meeting personalities.
Well, let's start with the expert, who, as you might guess, just loves to demonstrate their knowledge, often at the expense of others.
Ah, the meeting version of the know-it-all. I've definitely encountered a few of those in my time. How do you suggest handling them?
Well, the key is to acknowledge their expertise without letting them dominate the conversation. You might say something like, "Thank you for sharing your insights. That's valuable information." Now, building on that, how do others feel about?
So you're validating their contribution while also opening up the floor for others to participate.
Right. It's about creating a balanced and inclusive discussion where everyone feels comfortable sharing their ideas.
Okay, what about the opposite of the expert? The person who is perpetually negative and pessimistic.
Ah, you're talking about the great master. They approach everything with a sense of doom and gloom, constantly predicting failure.
The Debbie Downer of meetings, they can really suck the energy out of a room.
Indeed. And while it's important to acknowledge valid concerns, you don't want negativity to derail the entire meeting. One effective strategy is to reflect their statements back to them and then ask for alternative perspectives.
So you might say something like, "It sounds like you're really concerned about X. Does anyone else share that concern, or do you have a different perspective?"
Exactly. It shifts the focus away from negativity and encourages a more balanced discussion. And if they're open to it, you could even challenge them to play devil's advocate. Force them to consider a different point of view.
That's an interesting tactic. It forces them to engage with the issue from a new angle. Okay, who is next on our list of meeting personalities?
Let's talk about the hijacker. This is the person who just tries to steer the meeting away from the agenda to serve their own purposes.
Oh, I've seen that happen. They start asking irrelevant questions or bringing up unrelated topics, and suddenly the meeting is going in a completely different direction.
Exactly. And the best way to handle the hijacker is to gently but firmly redirect the conversation back to the agenda.
So you might say something like, "That's an interesting point, but for the sake of time, let's stay focused on our main objective for today, which is..."
Exactly. And if they continue to disrupt the meeting, you might need to be a little more assertive. You could remind the group of the agreed-upon process, or simply ask, "Does anyone else feel like we're getting off track?"
Right. It's about appealing to the group's desire for a productive and focused discussion.
Hmm.
Okay, who else do we have on our meeting personality roster?
Next up is the hostile person. This is the individual who views every idea as a personal attack and responds with aggression.
Oh, I know that type. They're always ready for a fight.
Indeed. And dealing with them can be challenging, but one tactic is to actually use them as an example.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for instance, instead of presenting an idea directly, you could say something like, "Let's imagine that hostile person's team has started using this new system and has a problem with it. How might we address their concerns?"
That's interesting. By putting them in the hypothetical situation, you're less likely to trigger their defensiveness.
Right. You're engaging them in the problem-solving process without making it feel like a personal attack.
That's a clever strategy. Okay, on to the next personality type. Who do we have?
Let's discuss the joker. This is the person who just can't resist cracking jokes and trying to lighten the mood.
Oh, I know the type. Every meeting is a stand-up comedy routine for them.
Yes. And while some humor can be beneficial, it can become a problem when it starts to, derail the meeting and prevent serious work from getting done.
So how do you handle the joker without being a total killjoy?
Well, if the humor is appropriate and not too disruptive, you can try to build on it. Don't shut them down entirely, but use their humor to your advantage. Responding positively to a well-timed joke can actually make you seem more approachable and likable.
So don't be a stick in the mud.
Exactly. However, if the jokes start to become inappropriate or offensive, or if they're clearly preventing the meeting from achieving its objectives, then you need to draw a line.
So how do you do that without creating an awkward situation?
You can address the issue directly, but, in a lighthearted way. You might say something like, "Okay, everyone, let's save the stand-up routine for after the meeting. We've got a lot to cover today."
That's a good way to redirect their energy without making them feel like they're being punished. Okay, what about the nitpicker?
Ah, the nitpicker is the person who gets bogged down in tiny details, often interrupting to point out. Like minor errors or inconsistencies, they can be incredibly frustrating to deal with because they tend to lose sight of the bigger picture.
I've definitely worked with a few nitpickers in my time. They can really slow down a meeting and suck the energy out of the room.
Yes. And while it's important to be accurate and thorough, it's also important to keep things moving and stay focused on the key objectives. One way to handle the nitpicker is to use a technique called self-revelation.
Self-revelation, what does that mean?
It's about revealing something about yourself. to create a connection and diffuse the tension. For example, if they point out a minor typo on a slide, you could say something like, "Good catch. Spelling has never been my strong suit."
Oh, I see. You're acknowledging their point, but in a way that's self-deprecating and disarming. It takes the sting out of their criticism.
Exactly. And it subtly shifts the focus away from the minor detail and back to the bigger picture.
That's a clever strategy. Okay, who's next on our list of meeting personalities?
Next up, we have the rivals. These are two meeting participants who are constantly trying to score points off each other, using the meeting as a platform for their personal feud.
Oh, it's like they're turning the meeting into their own personal reality show.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
They might interrupt each other, make sarcastic comments, or just try to undermine each other's ideas.
Uh.
It can be very distracting for everyone else in the meeting.
So how do we handle these meeting rivals without getting caught in the crossfire?
Well, if their behavior is becoming disruptive, you need to address it directly. You can be firm but polite, saying something like, "Hey, I appreciate your passion, but let's try to keep the discussion focused on the task at hand."
So remind them that the meeting is not about their personal drama.
Right. It's about achieving a shared goal. And if they continue to bicker, you might need to be more assertive. You can say something like, "It seems like there's some tension between you two. Perhaps we can address that separately after the meeting. For now, let's focus on."
So you're acknowledging the tension, but also setting a clear boundary. Okay, who's next?
Let's talk about the show-off. This is the person who uses the meeting to boast about their accomplishments and try to impress everyone.
I know that type. They love to be the center of attention.
Exactly. They might dominate the conversation, interrupt others, or just try to steer the discussion toward their own achievements. The key here is to acknowledge their accomplishments without letting them take over the meeting.
So you might say something like, "That's great work you've done on X." Now, bringing it back to our current project, what are your thoughts on?
Precisely. You're validating their work, but also redirecting the focus back to the topic at hand.
Okay, makes sense. What about the fault finder?
The fault finder is the person who is constantly criticizing everything and everyone, always finding something to complain about.
The eternal pessimist. It can be so draining to be around someone who's always finding the negative.
Indeed.
Yeah.
One effective tactic for handling the fault finder is to ask for specific examples to support their criticisms. You might say, "I hear your concerns. Can you give me an example of a situation where this has actually been a problem?"
That's a good way to make them think more critically about their complaints and see if there's any real substance to them.
Right. And if they can't provide specific examples, it becomes clear that their criticism is unfounded. You can also try to reframe their negativity in a more positive light.
How do you do that?
Well, if they're complaining about a problem, you could say something like, "Okay, so we've identified a challenge. Now let's brainstorm some potential solutions."
So you're shifting the focus from complaining to problem solving. I like that.
It's about turning negativity into a predictive force.
Okay, on to the next meeting personality. Who do we have?
Next up is the sneaky one. This is the person who tries to manipulate the meeting to achieve their own goals, often through underhanded tactics.
Ooh, that's a tough one. They're like the master manipulator of the meeting room.
They might try to discredit others, spread rumors, or form alliances to get their way. It can be very difficult to deal with them because they often operate behind the scenes.
So how do we outsmart the sneaky one?
Well, the key is to be aware of their tactics and to be prepared to challenge them directly. Don't be afraid to call them out if you suspect they're being manipulative.
So shine a light on their sneaky behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can also try to neutralize their influence by building alliances with other meeting participants.
Their strength in numbers. Okay,
Yeah.
who else is on our list?
Let's talk about the whisperer. This is the person who makes side comments to their neighbors, creating a distraction and preventing others from focusing on the discussion.
Oh, they're the ones who think they're being discreet, but everyone can hear them.
Exactly. They're often unaware of how disruptive their behavior is. One way to handle the whisperer is to simply make eye contact with them and give them a look that conveys disapproval.
The silent but deadly glare.
Precisely. You can also try to redirect their attention by asking them a question or directly addressing their side comments.
So bring their whispering out into the open.
Right. And if their behavior continues, you might need to be more direct, saying something like, "I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble focusing with all the side conversations. Can we please keep our comments to the group?"
That's a polite but firm way to address the issue.
Okay, on to our final meeting personality. Who is it?
Last but not least, we have the woolly thinker. This is the person who makes vague and abstract contributions to the meeting, often leaving others confused and frustrated. Oh, they're the ones who talk in circles without ever really getting to the point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They might ask rambling questions, make irrelevant comments, or just fail to express their ideas clearly.
So how do we help the woolly thinker become more concise and focused?
Well, the key is to ask clarifying questions. If they make a vague statement, you could say something like, "I'm not sure I understand. Can you give us a concrete example?"
So help them ground their thoughts in reality.
Right. You can also try to reframe their woolly thinking in a more concrete way. For example, you could say, "So it sounds like you're suggesting that we," and then rephrase their idea in a more specific and actionable way.
Oh, I see. You're giving them a structure to help them articulate their thoughts more clearly.
Exactly. And if they're still struggling to get their point across, you can appeal to the rest of the group. You can say something like, "Am I the only one who's a bit lost here? Can anyone else help me understand what Woolly Thinker is trying to say?"
That's a great way to get the group involved and put a little bit of pressure on the woolly thinker to be more clear and concise.
Yes. And it might even help the rest of the group understand the Woolly Thinker's point, which could lead to a more productive discussion. Now, in addition to those specific personality types, Lilley also offers some general tips for making meetings more productive. Would you like to hear those?
Absolutely. I'm always looking for ways to improve my meeting game.
Okay, so first, he suggests starting the meeting with a pre-prepared outline or set of suggestions rather than a blank piece of paper.
So don't expect people to just magically come up with brilliant ideas on the spot.
Exactly. Give them something to work with. You could say something like, "To get the ball rolling, I've put together some initial thoughts."
That makes sense. It gives everyone a starting point for the discussion. What else?
Second, he emphasizes the importance of focusing on the 80% of the issue that everyone can agree on and moving forward from there.
Right. Don't get bogged down in the minutia.
Exactly. Aim for consensus on the main points and let the smaller details work themselves out later.
Okay, that's a good reminder. What else?
Third, make sure that everyone in the meeting has the authority to make decisions and commit to a course of action.
So there's no point in having a meeting if the people in the room can't actually make any decisions?
Precisely. Before the meeting, be clear about who has the authority to approve budgets, sign contracts, and so on.
Makes sense. What else?
Fourth, clearly articulate the objectives of the meeting and the process for achieving those objectives.
So everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be doing it.
Exactly. Lay out the roadmap for the meeting.
Okay. And finally?
Finally, Lilley stresses the importance of managing time effectively and keeping the meeting on track.
Because time is money, and no one wants to be stuck in a meeting that drags on forever.
Exactly. Set clear time limits for each agenda item and stick to them as much as possible.
These are all such practical and helpful tips. I'm going to put these into practice at my next meeting.
I have no doubt you'll see a significant improvement in your meeting productivity.
So far we've covered a lot of ground on dealing with difficult people in various workplace settings, from one-on-one interactions to those challenging group meetings. But there's one more area I want to explore before we wrap up this deep dive, dealing with difficult people during times of change.
Yes. Change. It can be a real breeding ground for difficult behavior.
Yeah.
People often resist change because it triggers feelings of fear, uncertainty, and insecurity.
They worry about how the change will affect them, their jobs, their future, and when people are feeling anxious, they're more likely to, act out.
Absolutely. So how do we navigate those tricky waters and help people through times of transition? First and foremost, it's essential to recognize that change is often difficult for people. Even those who are typically easygoing might become a bit more challenging during times of transition.
So be prepared for some pushback, even from people you wouldn't normally expect it from.
Exactly. And remember that their resistance is often a symptom of their underlying anxiety, not necessarily a personal attack on you or the proposed changes.
So empathy is key. Put yourself in their shoes and try to understand where their resistance is coming from.
Yes. And just as importantly, communicate, communicate, communicate. The more information people have about the changes, the less anxious they'll be.
Transparency is key. It builds trust and helps alleviate some of that fear of the unknown.
Exactly. And whenever possible, involve people in the change process. Give them a sense of ownership and control rather than just imposing changes upon them.
That's a great point. When people feel like they're part of the solution, they're more likely to embrace change.
Absolutely. And finally, don't forget to highlight the positive aspects of the change and how it will benefit them personally.
So focus on the what's in it for me factor.
Precisely. People are much more receptive to change when they can see how it will improve their lives or make their work easier.
These are all fantastic tips for navigating change. I'm definitely going to keep these in mind the next time my company goes through a major transition.
I have no doubt you'll be able to guide your team through those changes with grace and effectiveness. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to share one final piece of advice from Lilley that I think is particularly relevant in today's digital world.
I'm intrigued. What is it?
He emphasizes the power of handwritten notes, especially in a world that's increasingly dominated by emails, texts, and instant messages.
Oh, the lost art of the handwritten note. I love that he's bringing this back.
He believes that a handwritten note can have a huge impact, especially when it comes to expressing gratitude, offering encouragement, or simply acknowledging someone's hard work.
I completely agree. There's something so personal and thoughtful about a handwritten note. It shows that you took the time and effort to do something special.
Exactly. And in a world where most communication is electronic and often impersonal, a handwritten note can really stand out. It's a way to make a genuine connection.
I love that. So we should all make a commitment to revive the art of the handwritten note.
Absolutely. It's a simple gesture that can make a world of a difference.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored different types of difficult people, learned strategies for dealing with them effectively, and discussed how to handle tricky situations in meetings and during times of change. We even talked about the power of handwritten notes. I feel like I've gained a whole new toolkit for navigating the complexities of the workplace.
Me too. And one of the most valuable insights I've gained from Lilley's work is that dealing with difficult people isn't just about mastering specific techniques or strategies. It's also about cultivating the right mindset.
What do you mean by the right mindset?
It's about approaching difficult people with a sense of curiosity rather than judgment. It's about recognizing that their behavior is often a reflection of their own internal struggles, not necessarily a personal attack on you.
So it's about shifting our perspective and seeing things from their point of view.
Exactly. And when we can do that, we can approach these interactions with more empathy, compassion, and understanding.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about seeing the human being behind the difficult behavior.
Right? And when we can do that, we open up the possibility for connection, even in the most challenging of situations.
That's such a powerful insight. It's about transforming those interactions from battles into opportunities for growth and understanding.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect note to end on for part 2 of our deep dive into dealing with difficult people.
I agree. We've given our listeners a lot to think about, and I'm excited to continue the conversation in part 3.
Welcome back to our deep dive on dealing with those, difficult people. In the previous parts, we've really explored a whole spectrum of those challenging personalities and learned some really incredible, really useful strategies for handling those, tricky situations.
Yeah, and I hope those insights have really resonated with you and given you some tools to navigate your own workplace, dynamics. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to maybe turn the lens inward for a moment.
What do you mean by that? Well, we spent a lot of time talking about how to deal with other people's difficult behavior, but what about our own behavior? Could we be the difficult one sometimes?
That's a great question. It's so easy to focus on how others are behaving and forget to, examine our own actions and how they might be impacting those around us.
Oh yeah, it's incredibly easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we're always the reasonable one. We're the one in the right and everyone else is the problem. But that kind of thinking can really blind us to our own, shortcomings.
So it's all about self-awareness, right? Taking a step back and honestly assessing our own behavior.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves those tough questions. Am I being too critical? Am I interrupting others? Am I being disrespectful? Am I contributing to a negative work environment?
And just as importantly, being open to feedback from others. Sometimes, we need that outside perspective to help us see our blind spots.
Absolutely. And when someone does give you feedback, try not to get defensive.
Yeah.
Listen to what they have to say and consider if there's any truth to it.
It's all about being open to learning and growing, both personally and professionally.
Precisely. And by becoming more self-aware, we can not only improve our own behavior, but also create a more, positive and productive work environment for everyone.
That's such an important point. Sometimes the biggest impact we can have is by working on ourselves.
Absolutely. So as we conclude this deep dive, I encourage you to, reflect on your own interactions. Are there any patterns in your behavior that might be contributing to difficult situations? What steps can you take to become a more positive and supportive colleague?
Those are great questions for our listeners to ponder. I know I'll be doing some self-reflection after this conversation. And on that note, any final words of wisdom or encouragement for our listeners as they, head back out into the world armed with their new insights into difficult people?
Just remember that dealing with difficult people is rarely easy. But with the right tools and the right mindset, you can transform those interactions from draining to manageable or even productive. Be patient, be strategic, and don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. You've got this.
I love that. It's all about empowering ourselves to, navigate those challenging interpersonal dynamics with grace and confidence. And remember, sometimes the most difficult person we have to deal with is ourselves. So a little self-awareness and a commitment to personal growth can go a long way in creating a more harmonious and productive work environment.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of difficult people.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.